Let's talk about structure and function of your cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex has 6 layers, and each layer has, so we consider as hypercolumns. We call it hypercolumns. And inside each hypercolumn, we have a set of mini-columns. And inside each mini-columns, we have a set of neurons. And all of these layers are connected to each other and also to subcortical areas. And so it is considered to be both hierarchical and both recurrent. So it's a combination of them that makes us, for example, do reasoning, higher cognitive tasks, comparison, and many other things such as reasoning. So I'm interested in explaining this important article in 2007, Structure and Function of the Cerebral Cortex. But these are positive samples. They are related to this article. And so the gray matter of the cerebral cortex is a convoluted layered sheet of tissue. It's just 2 to 3 millimeters thick, but with a surface area of several hundred square centimeters. So let me project it like this. So this area is big, but the thickness is very small. The thickness is about just 2 or 3 millimeters. And the interconnection, as I said, we have 6 layers, and they are connected to each other, and each one has some hypercolumns. These are hypercolumns, and inside of that, we have some mini columns, and inside mini columns, we have lots of neurons. And this is the human cerebrum that is very, very similar to the mouse cerebellum. And this is mini column. And so the study of cortical layers is the study of cortical specialization in the radial dimension and how it is conserved from area to area. Of course, there are subtle variations in the laminar structure across the cortical sheet, which form a complementary means of identifying separate areas, as, for example, de Broadbent's. He was a biologist, and all of these numbers are for him. You will see that it's very old things, but it's very interesting that some areas are for attention, some areas are for visual function at the back of your mind, sound, memory, executive function is in your prefrontal cortex, and you have many different regions. And how cortex connects to itself? So you can consider it as some input-output forms, and of course it is recurrent as well. And so some layers, for example 5, I will explain that each layer has its own significance, and all of them are important. And so in this article, they explain this, that we go through all of these layers 1 through 6, but if you go through these regions, this long area regions that I told you, it's a big area, they are related to each other and go in an ascending pathway or in a descending pathway. So how cortex connects to itself? Using the visual system as an example, there are many indications that attention to particular objects, features, or locations in the visual scene is associated with increased activity of the neurons with matching receptive field characteristics. In a similar vein, the descending pathway could mediate expectations or higher level hypotheses as to what may be present in the retinal image. The intrinsic interactions across layers could then be viewed as a matching process between visual signals, looking for an explanation, visual hypothesis, searching for evidence. The fact that this is couched in the semi-theatrical term reveals a paucity of any more profound mechanistic understanding of the interaction between these two streams. The ascending pathway appears to have a driving character as illustrated by the systematic growth in receptive field size caused by spatially convergent connections from one level to the next. The neurons at each level are capable of being activated by a small subset of their reference. There is at least as much, if not more, spatial convergence if the descending pathway and the synaptic efficacy were also no different. Receptive fields at the lower level would soon inherit the pool size of the higher level fields. As this is not observed in any layer of any area of any species so far studied, it is relatively safe to conclude that the synaptology of the ascending and descending pathway must differ significantly. But how cortex connects to itself, there is another paragraph in this important article that says, the output from motor cortex to spinal motor neurons derives entirely from layer 5 pyramidal cells. In fact, layer 5 qualifies as the motor output layer over the entire cortex, because nearly all signals directing behavior emanate from this layer. Corticospinal neurons in layer 5 may be densest in M1, but are distributed among several somatomotor areas in visual cortex. For instance, layer 5 is the source of output to the superior colliculus, a midbrain center governing head and eye movement. You see, each layer has a different function. The same layer of frontal eye field, meanwhile, has direct output to brainstem. Other targets of layer 5 include cerebellum, the striatum, this is in basal ganglia, very important in reinforcement learning. It's a reward mechanism. And also the thalamus, which is the gateway to all of your sensory inputs, and also many, many different functions that is not even discovered now. And if to sample the activity of these superficial layers, generally speaking, layer 5 neurons have relatively large receptive fields that are trigger happy. Their high spontaneous activity reflects a resting membrane potential that is relatively close to the threshold for initiation of an action potential. The best documented example is the output from V1 to superior colliculus, which is found to arise from large pyramidal neurons with apical dendrites rising to layer 1. Compared to other layers or even other layer 5 neurons, these cells are less selective for the orientation and direction of a visual stimulus. So the more we read, we understand, the more we understand that our knowledge is very limited about our brain. Almost many of these informations are at its infancy. We are still beginning to understand these important things. That is a source of inspiration for deep learning and artificial intelligence as well. These are rational characteristics for an output signal that basically serves to provide spatial coordinates for the acquisition of target objects. A sophisticated target description is presumably irrelevant to the ocular or skeletal apparatus and can be locked up in cortical circuitry for the unique appreciation of our cognitive faculties. Now, layer 6 also connects to the thalamus, including its inhibitory sheath, the thalamic reticular nucleus, but as this is merely the outgoing component of a thalamocortical loop, layer 6 does not act as an alternative gateway for cortical signals to directly influence behavior. As a rule, neurons making either cortical or subcortical connections form separate populations. There is considerable diversity within each population, although the picture is confused by the fact that the outputs are frequently carried by the axons bifurcating towards two or more targets. Much or all of the layer 5 outputs to thalamus, for instance, is formed by collaterals of axons traveling toward the brainstem. There is no prominent set of neurons, the giant myelin cells of primary visual cortex, that manage to flout out the above generalization, in that they are sited in the layer 6, connect by bifurcating axons to both the superior colliculus and higher cortical areas. And so you see how it is modulating interactions between visual cortex and visual thalamus. And how do layer 5 and 6 differ? A comparison of respective thalamic connections is highly instructive in regard to the differing functional roles of the subcortical outputs issuing from layer 5 and 6. The former is regarded as driving and the latter is modulatory, as muted both for the action of the A and D cortical pathways, although the thalamic evidence is more robust. These differing characteristics are part and parcel of distinction between first and second order thalamic nuclei. A first order nucleus is a classic relay nucleus, such as the dorsolateral geniculate nucleus of the visual system, which feeds V1 and receives feedback from layer 6 of V1. Output from layer 5 of V1 does not terminate the LGN, but only in the second order nucleus. The second order nucleus is defined by the fact that it received scant direct sensory input. Instead, its deriving inputs are provided from cortical layer 5. Anatomically, layer 5 terminals in the pulvinar match retinols terminals each forms only a small minority of the overall input to their respective nuclei, but the terminals are large and strategically placed on proximal dendrites. It is the retinal terminals that confer their response characteristics upon geniculate cells in layer 5 afferents to pulvinar are expected to achieve a similar driving effect. By comparison, terminals of layer 6 afferents are smaller and terminate less focally. The interaction between V1 and the LGN has been studied more intensively than any other feedback system. Cortical feedback appears to modulate the response of geniculate neurons to a feature according to its context with the surrounding image. And these are the function of subcortical loops. They are related to other parts such as thalamus and those things. So you should know that your cortical loops, the sensory inputs come to the cerebral cortex, but it gives feedback to striatum, which is a part of basal ganglia. And then it gives excitatory to SN, and then it gives to thalamus, which is an inhibitory for different regions of cerebral cortex. But the subcortical loops are like this. These are cortical loops, these are subcortical loops. And this is the function of subcortical loops. And you should know striatum is part of basal ganglia, very important for reinforcement learning because it is a reward mechanism to create some actions, and the thalamus gives this feedback and selects some part of the cortex. And so our neurons that are active are not fixed, they change. And this is a mechanism, this loop creates those activations of different regions. Sometimes these are active, sometimes the other one are active. Think about that hypercolumn and mini columns scenario that I explained. And this is the function of subcortical loops. You have cortical motor system, the thalamus gives actions to the cortical motor systems, and you have sensory inputs. As I said, thalamus is just a gateway. You can think about it simply as just a gateway to all of the sensory inputs. Kind of filter, kind of modulator, but its role is very significant and is less known. But the frontal cortex, this one is your working memory. This is what you do, your cognitive task, is connected to striatum, and it understands the value and creates rewards. And just so what is the function of striatum? As I said, is a cluster of interconnected nuclei that form a part of a basal ganglia. It is involved in decision making. Reinforcement learning in machine learning is here, such as motor control, emotion, habit formation, and reward. The term striatum describes the striped appearance of gray and white matter containing nuclei that form distinct cortical substructures. So this is the prefrontal cortex, layer 1 to layer 6. It gives, this is your working memory, by the way. This gives to thalamus. The thalamus gives the context to the striatum. Striatum is for decision making, your basal ganglia. And now these feedback mechanism provides that you understand, first of all, what is it and what should we do. It says, what is it and what should we do? Striatum says, what should we do? Because it's like about, it understands the reward and wants to do some action. And what is the function of VTA? Nobody talks about VTA, but it's very important. Ventral area is well known for regulating reward consumption, learning, memory, and addiction behavior through mediating dopamine releasing in downstream regions. And so its long-term memory network, our prefrontal cortex is looking for goal expectancy. But this is the hippocampus that creates context prediction error and gives VTA gives to both hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, send messages to them. And this is the big picture that I really love, because you understand that prefrontal cortex and cerebral cortex are important for cognitive tasks, and they, for example, your hippocampus is important for consolidation when you are asleep, and the hippocampus also does pattern separation, pattern completion in C1, because inside of it, there is a world inside of it, C1, C2, and each one has a different task. And this gives information to striatum. As I said, this is a part of basal ganglia, important for decision making. And now this is the SDN that I told, and this is the VTA that I told you. It also gives to striatum some, for example, the addiction information, those things. And we have different neuromodulators such as dopamine, GABA, glutamate. And so it's very important. This picture is very important. It gives you the whole understanding of your brain. But you understand that it's like a design. It's like somebody has designed it. It's not just an evolution. Somebody has designed it because it's very elegant. Everything has a role, like a microservice that each task is for a different thing. And so in microservice architecture, we are using separation of concerns principle. For example, one area is for reinforcement learning, the other area is for continual learning. because you are layering the other area for just cognitive tasks, the other area for just encoding your inputs. So each module in this microservice architecture, if you're familiar with software architecture, has a desk. Unlike